I didn't notice the missing names until the ink began to fade in my hands. At first I thought it was just the age of the paper, the way old documents yellow and crumble. But this was different. The fading wasn't uniform. Whole branches of my family line stopped abruptly, like someone had taken a blade to the page and sliced away their existence. I sat at my father's old desk, the one that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, the surface worn smooth where his elbows used to rest. Afternoon light poured in through the dusty curtains, but it didn't make the page any clearer. If anything, the sunlight made the gaps seem sharper, emptier. I traced the lines with my fingertip. My father's name was there, my grandmother's too. But when my eyes followed the lines leading to certain cousins, uncles, aunts, there was nothing. Just blank space where names should be. The tree was hand-drawn in my father's careful script, but the empty spaces looked almost burned, not charred exactly. More like the fibers of the paper had been singed without flame. A faint brown edge ringed each absence, like the ghost of something erased in fire. I told myself maybe it was water damage, or mildew. Old paper is fragile, after all, but the marks were too clean, too deliberate. The longer I stared, the heavier the air seemed to get in that little room. It was as if the silences in the paper were pressing down on me. I kept glancing toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there. I found myself whispering the names I knew should have been there. I could almost hear them in my father's voice, the way he used to tell family stories on winter nights. But the moment I tried to picture their faces, nothing came. Like my mind hit the same blank wall the paper had. I set the tree aside for a moment, trying to focus on the pile of other papers I'd been sorting. Birth certificates, deeds, old letters, all intact. No scorch marks, no missing names. Only that one sheet carried the strange wounds. When I picked it up again, my skin prickled. I could swear the blank spaces were larger than before. I ran my finger over them, and for just a moment, I felt warmth, faint but real, like embers that had never cooled. I don't know why, but I folded the paper carefully, tucked it back into its envelope, and locked it in the desk drawer. And even as I turned the key, I knew this wasn't over. Those gaps weren't mistakes, they were waiting. When I opened the front door, it smelled like someone had just been living there. That warm, stale mix of old coffee, soap, and the faint musk of skin that lingers after people leave a room. I froze in the doorway, my keys still dangling from my fingers. The house was supposed to be empty. It had been months since my father died, and no one had stepped inside since the funeral. I shut the door behind me, the click of the lock sounding louder than it should have in the stillness. Dust floated in the thin strips of light cutting through the curtains. It coated the furniture, the picture frames, the mantel, everything except for one strange, clean path on the floor. It was a trail of footprints. I could see them clearly in the dust, starting right there in the hallway, as if someone had stepped inside not long ago. Each print was sharp at the edges, undisturbed. They weren't mine. The boots were larger, heavier. My first thought was maybe a neighbor had come in to check on the place, but I'd never given anyone a key. And then I noticed where the trail led. Down the hallway, past the kitchen door, stopping at the cellar. The cellar door was closed, but it wasn't the same as I remembered. The lock was new, bright metal. No rust, no dust. I crouched and touched it. Cold, solid, too recently installed to belong in this old house. I straightened up and listened. The air in that hallway felt heavy, thicker somehow, like it was pressing against my skin. I couldn't hear anything on the other side, but that silence felt unnatural, as if it were holding its breath. I told myself not to be ridiculous. Someone must have been in here before the place was sealed. Maybe my father had changed the lock before he died. But that didn't explain the fresh footprints. It didn't explain the smell, the sense of presence. I stepped back, my eyes tracing that single set of tracks again. No return prints. Whoever it was, they hadn't come back out. I left the cellar door locked and backed away, telling myself I'd deal with it later. But as I turned to head upstairs, I swore I heard something shift behind that door. Just the faintest scrape, like someone adjusting their weight. Waiting. It clicked against the wood like it wanted me to find it. I'd been sweeping under my father's old desk when the broom caught on something solid. I thought it was just a nail or a loose board, but when I reached down, my fingers brushed cold metal. The floorboards in that room had always been warped, the wood swollen from years of damp winters. One plank near the desk had lifted just enough for me to pry it back. Dust puffed up into my face, stinging my nose, and there it was, an iron key. It wasn't small like a house key. It was heavy, thick, its teeth jagged in a way that looked almost wrong. Not symmetrical, not neat, like it had been made for something old. Something that didn't follow the kind of rules locks follow now. I turned it in my hand, the metal leaving a faint grey smear on my skin. It was colder than the rest of the room, as if it had been sitting in ice instead of under wood. The shape of it made my stomach twist with recognition. It could fit the cellar lock. I didn't want it to, but I knew. The teeth matched the strange, uneven slots I'd seen when I crouched by that door. The memory made my chest tighten. I told myself not to be ridiculous. It was just a key. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been left there on purpose, tucked away but not hidden well enough. Like someone wanted me to find it eventually, but not too soon. I put it on the desk, but even from across the room, I could feel its presence. My eyes kept drifting back to it. I tried to keep cleaning, but every creak of the house made me glance toward the hallway, half expecting the cellar door to be standing open. Finally, I picked it up again, telling myself I'd just put it somewhere safe. The weight of it settled in my palm like it belonged there. And that's when I noticed something strange. Its edges were warm now, not from my hand, but as if it had been holding heat the whole time, waiting. I locked it away in the desk drawer, the same place I'd hidden the family tree, but as the drawer shut, I heard a faint metallic sound from down the hallway. Like a lock, turning itself. Someone had scraped the eyes off every person but one. At first I thought it was just damage from age, maybe mold or water stains, but when I stepped closer, I saw the lines. Thin, deliberate cuts where a blade had torn through the photograph, leaving deep white scars in the paper. It was the old family portrait that had always hung in the hallway, the one my grandmother used to dust every Sunday. I remembered standing in front of it as a child, tracing the outlines of the faces I didn't recognize, hearing her voice behind me saying, "Never look too far back." Now, all those faces were gone. My father's, my uncle's, even the children standing in the front row, all but one. Tingtera tin figyesmo today. My grandmother's eyes were still there, staring straight ahead in that same way they always had, dark, sharp, and just a little too focused. The rest of her face was untouched, perfect against the ruined silhouettes surrounding her. The difference made the air in the hallway feel heavier, like the photograph itself was holding something in. I reached out without thinking, my fingers stopping just before touching the glass. It was cold. Colder than the wall. My own reflection hovered faintly over hers, and for a split second I thought her mouth had moved. The frame was nailed tight to the wall, but I still had the urge to take it down and check the back. I wanted to see if there was another picture beneath it, or a date, or some hidden note, but I couldn't make myself do it. Instead, I stepped back, studying the rows of headless bodies, their suits and dresses still crisp after all these years. The scratches were clean, not jagged, as if whoever had done it had taken their time. It didn't feel like vandalism. It felt like removal. I remembered the way my grandmother used to watch me when I asked questions about the people in that picture. The way her tone changed when she said some names didn't need remembering. A floorboard creaked behind me, but when I turned, the hallway was empty. Still, I had the strange sense that those missing faces were closer now, leaning in from the edges just out of sight. I backed away slowly, but even from the top of the stairs, I could feel her eyes on me. Not the house, not the picture. Her forehead evolved, her eyes. I thought the creaks were just the house settling, until they called my name. At first it was faint, buried under the sound of wind rattling the windows. I froze in bed, my breath caught in my throat, waiting for it to come again. It did. This time I heard it clearly. My name, drawn out low and slow, like it was being pulled through water. The sound seemed to come from beneath me, somewhere deep under the floor. I sat up, straining to listen. The old house was quiet again, but the quiet wasn't comforting. It felt expectant, like the walls were holding their breath. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks after a long day. But then I heard it a third time, softer but closer. The sound rolled up through the floorboards from the direction of the cellar, each syllable bending unnaturally at the end, the way my father used to do when he was calling me from another room. Only, my father was gone. My skin prickled as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The boards were cold against my feet. I leaned forward, pressing my ear to the floor. There was a faint whispering underneath. Not just one voice, several, layered together, murmuring so low I couldn't catch the words. The only one I could make out was the one that sounded like him, repeating my name. I stayed frozen there, half listening, half terrified to hear what came next. Every instinct told me not to go near the cellar, not to answer. I pushed myself back up, trying to shake it off. But the voices didn't stop. They rose and fell like waves, never quite loud enough to be clear, but never fading completely either. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat in the corner of the bed, staring at the dark outline of my bedroom door. I kept imagining the cellar door swinging open downstairs, slow and silent, and something stepping out onto the hall floor. Eventually I told myself I was being ridiculous and forced my eyes shut. But just as I started to drift, the floorboard directly under my bed groaned, and my father's voice whispered, almost kindly, "I'm right here." The key fit, but the lock didn't want to turn. I stood there in the dim hallway, the cold air from the back door brushing against my neck, staring at that old cellar door like it was daring me. The iron key had been sitting in a dusty box for years, and yet it slid into the keyhole like it had been waiting for this moment. I twisted my wrist, expecting the soft click of tumblers, but instead there was this stubborn resistance, as if the lock itself was alive and didn't want me inside. My hand tightened. I tried again. The metal groaned faintly, not from rust, but something else, something that felt intentional. That was when I noticed it. The key wasn't cold. It should have been icy from the draft, but it was warm against my fingers. Not just warm, almost pulsing, like there was heat coming from deep inside the metal. My skin prickled, and I pulled my hand back slightly, feeling my own breath quicken. I told myself it was just old iron holding on to the warmth of my touch, but my grip felt damp now, as if the key had begun to sweat in my palm. I almost dropped it. Then I heard it. A soft sound, faint and deliberate, coming from the other side of the cellar door. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. The wood quivered under each stroke, like something was testing its strength from inside. I froze, leaning closer before I could stop myself. My ear hovered inches from the rough wood, and the smell of old dust and something sharp, like wet stone, crept into my nose. The scratching grew slower, almost thoughtful, like it knew I was there. I forced myself to pull the key out, my hand trembling. The lock felt heavier now, as if removing the key took more effort than putting it in. My heart thudded against my ribs so hard it drowned out the faint hiss of the wind behind me. The moment the key was free, the scratching stopped. I stayed there, still holding it, staring at the door's black iron hinges. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It pressed in, making my ears ring. And then, just as I started to turn away, something brushed the inside of the door. A single, slow drag, like the back of a fingernail. I didn't run. I should have, but I didn't. Because for just a second, I thought I heard it whisper my name. I found her in the census, but she died before she was born. At first I thought I'd misread it. The handwriting was old, faded and cramped, but there it was in black ink, Margaret Hale, listed as 22 years old in the 1920 census. And then another record claiming she died in childbirth in 1918, 2 years before she was even alive. I sat hunched over the screen, scrolling between documents, my fingers going cold despite the heat from the desk lamp. Each record was official, each one stamped and signed, and each one completely impossible. I dug deeper, tracing her through baptism lists, property transfers, anything I could get my hands on. But after that one census entry, she vanished. No marriage license, no obituary, no grave. It was as if Margaret had been pulled out of time, leaving just enough behind to whisper that she existed. The air in the study felt heavier as I read her name over and over. I whispered it aloud, just to hear how it sounded. Margaret Hale. The name rolled off my tongue strangely, like it didn't want to be spoken. I found one more record, an attendance sheet from a local sewing circle dated 1921. Her name was the last on the list. The ink trailed faintly, like the pen had hesitated before finishing her surname. That was the final trace of her. After that, nothing. A shadow shifted in the reflection of my laptop screen, and I spun around, heart racing. The study was empty, the hallway beyond silent. I turned back, telling myself it was just my eyes playing tricks after staring at text too long. But when I looked again, the census page had changed. The entry for Margaret was still there, but next to her name, in a space that had been blank before, was a small handwritten note. I leaned closer. The words were faint but clear enough. Do not look for her. The cursor on my screen blinked, like it was waiting for me to respond. My hand hovered over the mouse, my pulse thudding in my ears. I didn't click away. I didn't even breathe, because in the silence behind me, I heard the soft creak of a floorboard and the faintest sound of someone breathing. It wasn't the age of the paper that made my skin crawl. It was the warning. I found the letter by accident, tucked deep inside the back cover of an old family Bible. The pages were thick and yellowed, smelling faintly of dust and candle wax. When I opened it, something fragile slipped free and fluttered into my lap. It was a single sheet, brittle at the edges, the ink faded but still readable. The date at the top stopped me cold. April 3rd, 1912. My eyes flicked to the signature at the bottom, and my breath caught. It was my grandmother's handwriting. The same curling letters I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists my entire childhood, but she wasn't born until 1925. I read it once, then again, slower. If the root is disturbed, the branches will rot. There was more, but the rest was vague. Warnings about keeping the ground undisturbed, about the bloodline's anchor. Words like protect and sacrifice bled through the sentences, but never explained anything fully. I turned the letter over, looking for more. On the back, in much smaller writing, there was something else. A list of names. I recognized some. They were family members, though most were long gone. But halfway down the list, there was one name scratched out so violently the paper had torn. The edges of the whole were blackened, like they'd been burned. I sat there on the floor, the heavy silence of the house pressing in on me. It felt like the walls were leaning closer, listening. Outside, the wind pushed against the shutters, making them clatter softly, almost like teeth chattering. My grandmother never spoke much about her early life. She avoided family history altogether, but I'd always assumed that that was because of old grief. Not whatever this was. I slid the letter back into the Bible, though the thought of putting it away felt wrong, like shoving a living thing into a box. My fingers trembled as I closed the cover, and for a second, I swore I heard a faint sound beneath me, deep in the floor, like something shifting in the dirt. When I stood, the wood under my feet seemed softer, almost spongy. And just before I turned to leave, my eyes drifted to the margin of the page where the letter had been hidden. In faint, almost invisible pencil, someone had written a single word: dig. It was the same cellar door, but behind it, people. I found the photograph in a box of loose papers and receipts, the kind of clutter you'd expect in an attic. At first it looked like nothing, just a black and white shot of the back of the house. But my eyes kept drifting to the far right corner. where the cellar door gaped open. Inside the shadow, there were shapes, not objects, people. They stood shoulder to shoulder, pale skin, almost glowing against the dark. Their faces were turned toward the camera, but their eyes, they weren't eyes at all, just deep black pits that seemed to swallow the light. I counted them. 7. I didn't recognize any of them, yet something in me whispered that I'd seen them before, not in person, but somewhere that didn't belong to waking life. Their faces felt like the tail end of a nightmare I could never remember clearly. The longer I stared, the colder my hands got. I told myself it was just an old photo, maybe a trick of light or damage to the print. But then I noticed something that made my throat tighten. The cellar door in the picture had the same crooked hinge, the same chipped paint, but there was no lock on it. I'd only ever known it with a heavy iron latch that barely budged. And in this photo, it was wide open. I turned it over, half hoping for a date or a name. Instead, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Done, set, let them out again." Again. A gust of air moved across my neck, and I looked around the attic. The door was shut. No open windows. No draft. My heart thudded as I slid the picture back into the box, but even then I could feel their stares clinging to me. I carried the box downstairs, intending to tuck it away in a closet, but when I reached the bottom step, I froze. The cellar door was in my line of sight through the kitchen. The latch was hanging open. I told myself I'd locked it earlier. I was sure of it. But the metal bar dangled loose, and the gap at the edge of the door was just wide enough to see darkness breathing behind it. I set the box down without taking my eyes off that sliver of black, and in the quiet, I thought I heard the faintest rustle, like 7 people shifting their feet. The board shifted under a weight that wasn't mine. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, slow, heavy footsteps coming from directly below me. They weren't random creaks or the usual size of the old house. These were measured, deliberate. One pause, another, almost as if someone was pacing. I sat up, holding my breath, and the sound kept going. My first thought was that maybe I'd left the cellar door open after looking at that photograph. But no, when I'd gone to bed, I was sure I'd locked it tight. Still, the steps continued. They seemed to follow a path across the cellar floor, stop, then start again. My skin prickled as I realized they weren't moving toward anything. They were tracing some kind of pattern. I slid out of bed, careful not to let the floorboards above me groan. The hallway felt colder than it should have, and by the time I reached the kitchen, the air had that damp, earthy smell of the cellar, like the scent had seeped up through the cracks. I stood a few feet from the cellar door, listening. Silence. I waited. A full minute passed. 2. Then, just when I thought it was over, the sound exploded, fast pounding footsteps racing straight toward the stairs. I stumbled back, my hand flying to the nearest counter for balance, but then, nothing. Dead silence. My ears strained in the stillness, but the air felt heavier now, like it was pressing against me. I reached for the latch, then stopped. I don't know why, but the thought of opening that door made my stomach twist in knots. I felt certain that if I did, something would be standing on the other side, waiting. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The kitchen felt darker, the shadows pulling in tighter. I told myself I'd imagined it, that old houses just make noises, but the boards beneath my feet were still faintly vibrating, as though whatever had been down there hadn't stopped moving entirely. I turned toward the hallway, telling myself to go back to bed, to forget it. But then I heard the first step again, this time softer, slower, and it was no longer coming from below. It was on the stairs. Your family was always strange, but after that night, they stopped speaking to anyone. That's what Mrs. Carver said, her voice low like she was afraid someone might overhear. She'd lived next door since the late 50s, seen every face that came and went, and when she talked about that night, she didn't blink much, like her mind was still there. She said it was the summer of '64. She couldn't sleep because the crickets had gone dead quiet. That's when she noticed a glow, faint at first, leaking out from under our cellar door. It wasn't firelight, she said. It was too cold, too wrong. A pale greenish white that seemed to pulse like it was alive. She thought maybe there'd been an accident, so she crept closer. That's when she heard it. Low voices, speaking in a rhythm that wasn't English. At first she thought it was praying, but then she realized it wasn't words she recognized at all. She could hear them even through the walls of her own home, like they were inside her head. She told me she almost called the police, but something about the sound rooted her in place. The voices grew louder, faster, until they didn't sound like voices anymore, but something else entirely. She swore it was like listening to the wind scream inside a cave. Then, without warning, the chanting stopped. Dead silence. The light flickered once and vanished. Mrs. Carver said she stood there for nearly an hour, waiting for someone to leave, but no one did. The next morning, 3 cars were gone from the driveway. She remembered seeing suitcases in the back seat of one of them, but she never saw the people again. No moving trucks, no goodbye visits. Just gone. When she asked about them later, the remaining family members smiled too wide and said they'd left town for work, but their rooms were still furnished, their clothes still hanging in the closets. She leaned in close when she told me the last part, her hand trembling slightly on her teacup. That night, she said, she dreamed of the cellar door opening by itself. There was no one in the doorway, just that green glow spilling out, and she could hear something moving in the dark, dragging across the floor. When she woke up, the boards outside her back porch were damp, like someone had been standing there listening. The scent rose like something buried was trying to breathe. It started faint, just a damp hint in the air, like the smell after rain. I thought maybe a pipe had leaked somewhere, or the old wood was swelling with moisture, but each night it got stronger, heavier. By the 4th night, it was so thick it felt like it clung to my skin. It wasn't just dampness anymore, it was soil, rich, wet earth, the kind you smell when someone has been digging, and it was coming from the cellar. I'd pass by the door on my way to the kitchen, and the smell would hit me in a wave, warm and almost sweet in the worst way. I started noticing the floorboards right outside had tiny grains of dirt caught in the cracks, like someone had tracked them up from below, but no one had gone down there. At least, no one I saw. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down, pressed my face close to the thin gap under the door and breathed in. I wish I hadn't. It was stronger there, so strong it felt alive, like the earth itself was exhaling, and under it, faint but certain, was something else, something sour. I glanced at the thin strip of dirt that had collected along the baseboard. It was darker than the rest of the dust in the house, almost black, and it looked loose, like it had been freshly turned. The next night, it was worse. I woke up thirsty and padded down to the kitchen, but as soon as I reached the bottom step, I froze. The smell was so heavy it made my throat tighten, and then I noticed something I hadn't before. The line of dirt under the door wasn't just thicker, it was longer, spreading, like whatever was in there had been pushing from the other side. I stood there, staring at it, my glass of water trembling in my hand. For a second I thought I heard something shift behind the door. Not a creak, not a knock, a soft crumble, like a handful of soil being poured onto the floor. I told myself it was the house settling. That's what I wanted to believe, but when I went back upstairs I couldn't shake the image that kept forming in my mind. Something was down there, and it was digging its way up. They weren't sad nightmares, they were invitations. In the dream, I was always standing at the bottom of the cellar steps. The air was so heavy, it felt like breathing through wet cloth. The single bulb overhead swung slightly, casting thin shadows across the walls. At first, the floor looked solid, but then the dirt began to shift, rippling like something was moving underneath. A crack would open slowly, splitting the ground apart, and from that dark gap, pale fingers would push through. At first, just one hand, then another, then so many that the soil looked like it was alive with bone. They clawed at the edges of the hole, pulling themselves upward, but they never made it out. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My heart slammed against my ribs, but there was this strange pull, like they weren't trying to hurt me. They were reaching for me. Sometimes the hands would twitch, curling their fingers as if beckoning me closer. Sometimes they would stretch until their nails scraped the toes of my shoes, and when they touched me, the cold would spread so deep that I could feel it in my teeth. Then I'd hear it, a voice, low and close to my ear even though no one was standing there. My father's voice, calm, certain, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Finish the tree. That's all he'd say. Over and over. Finish the tree. I'd look down at my own hands and see dirt under my nails, as if I'd been digging too, and then the floor would split wider, showing not just hands but pieces of faces, empty sockets, grinning teeth half hidden in mud. They were so close, almost free, but the dream always stopped just before they pulled themselves into the light. The last time I had it, I woke up sitting straight up in bed, my sheets damp with sweat. My nails were packed with something dark. I told myself it was lint, that I must have scratched at my blanket while I slept. But when I stood and walked toward the bathroom, I could smell it again. The earth, wet, deep, and wrong. It was stronger than it had ever been, and for a moment I thought I could hear it too, the faint sound of shifting dirt, like something was moving under the house. I didn't want to go back to sleep, but part of me wanted to know what would happen if I let them pull me in. It wasn't set a foundation, it was a prison. I found that out in the basement of the county records office, where the air smelled like paper that had been rotting for centuries. The clerk slid a thick, dust-covered folder across the table, and when I opened it, I saw the date, 1874. My house's deed. Most of it was normal. Property lines, old tax records, until I reached a brittle page written in cramped, fading ink. It described the land before the house was built. There had been a flat stone buried deep in the earth, carved with markings no one could identify. The document called them pre-Christian symbols. Not letters, not numbers, just shapes that twisted in ways that made my eyes ache the longer I stared at the drawings. The note underneath said the markings were meant to bind. That word was underlined twice. It got stranger. The builders were warned by locals not to disturb it, but instead of removing it, they laid the foundation directly over it. One line in the record caught my breath. The stone will hold so long as it remains unbroken. I sat there, my fingers pressed against the page, thinking about the dreams, about the hands in the cellar, about my father's voice telling me to finish the tree. I flipped further, and there it was, a rough sketch of the seal, a circle with jagged edges, the center crowded with lines curling into one another like they were alive, and around it, almost hidden, were tiny shapes that looked like faces. Not human, not animal, something in between. The last entry in the file was dated a year before the house was finished. It mentioned an incident where workers refused to return after hearing noises coming from the hole at night. Noises like voices speaking in a language they didn't know. I closed the folder, but I could still see the symbols in my mind. I could feel them, the way you can feel the shape of a word on your tongue before you speak it. When I left the records office, the late afternoon sun should have felt warm, but it didn't. It was like the cold from those pages had followed me out, sinking into my skin. And as I walked back home, every step felt heavier, as if something deep under the ground knew I had read its name. They didn't set die, they were unmade. That's the only way I can describe it. I was sitting at my desk, my laptop glowing in the dark, the rest of the room swallowed in shadows. My fingers were cold, even though the heater was running. I'd been digging through every archive I could find, trying to trace the name that had been scratched off the family tree. It belonged to a man named Elias Hallow, except it didn't. Every time I found him, he vanished again. One old census showed him living on the property in 1911, but the following year's census? Gone. No death record. No grave. It was as if he had never existed. I thought maybe it was just bad record keeping, but then I found a newspaper clipping, small, tucked between ads for farm equipment and church notices. It mentioned a fire at the Hallow property. No bodies were recovered, but the article said neighbors heard something before the flames, screaming, yes, but not human, like the sound of an animal being dragged into the earth. I felt a knot in my stomach. I searched deeper, and the same thing kept happening. Every missing name in the tree, each one tied to a violent or strange end, was erased from official records within days. One drowned in a well that later had no water. Another vanished during a storm that never touched the house, but tore through the field behind it. It was always the same. They disappeared, and then every paper, every record acted like they were never there. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the gaps on the tree. These weren't just deaths. They were removals, like someone, or something, was reaching in and pulling them out of the world entirely. And for the first time I wondered if that was worse than dying. A chill ran through me when I thought about my own name, still inked neatly on the paper. I pictured someone coming along and scratching it out. Not after I died, but while I was still alive, while I was still screaming. I shut the laptop, but I could still see Elias's name burned into my mind. Or maybe it wasn't his name anymore. Maybe whatever took him had already started scraping it away from me too. This time it came from the top of the stairs. I froze halfway through brushing my teeth, the sound creeping through the silence of the house. Slow, dragging, like claws testing the wood. My first thought was that something had gotten in, maybe a raccoon or a rat, but the sound wasn't frantic, it was deliberate. I crept out into the hallway, every floorboard under me groaning. The scratching stopped for a second, then started again. Closer, my heart pounded in my ears. The only light came from the bathroom behind me, casting a pale rectangle on the hallway floor. When I reached the top of the stairs, it was quiet, completely quiet. I leaned over the railing, looking down into the dark. The cellar door was shut, just like I'd left it, but something about it looked different. I went down slowly, my hand trailing along the wall for balance. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that feels wet, like you're standing next to an open freezer. When I got close enough, I saw them deep, jagged gouges in the wood around the frame of the cellar door. Fresh. Splinters still clung to the edges. I reached out and touched one. It was so deep my fingertip disappeared into the groove. Whatever had made it had been strong and patient. That night I tried to sleep, telling myself it was just old wood shifting, or maybe the house settling. But then I heard it again, only this time it was under me. I sat up in bed, the blanket clutched in my hands, listening. Scratch, scratch, slow and steady, directly beneath where I was sitting. I could feel it in the floorboards like faint vibrations. My skin prickled. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, but the moment my feet touched the floor, the scratching stopped. The silence was worse. It felt like whatever it was knew I'd heard it and was waiting. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there staring at the door, watching shadows shift in the dim light leaking in from the street lamp outside. When morning came, I checked the floor by my bed. The wood looked the same, but when I pressed my ear to it, the faint smell of damp earth drifted up through the cracks. Something was moving down there, and it wasn't staying in the cellar anymore. If I hadn't smelled the smoke, I'd never have found it. It was faint at first, like the memory of a fire that had long gone out. I was cleaning in the living room when it drifted past me, sharp and bitter, nothing like the sweet smell of a winter fireplace. My family hadn't used the chimney in years, but the scent was coming from there. I moved closer, feeling a strange chill radiating from the bricks. When I reached inside, my fingers brushed something rough. It wasn't wood or ash. I pulled it out slowly, coughing as a cloud of soot drifted into the air. It was a book, or what was left of one. The leather cover was cracked, the edges blackened and curling, as if it had been half burned but stubbornly refused to turn to ash. My hand shook as I flipped it open, careful not to tear the brittle pages. The handwriting was my grandfather's. I recognized it instantly. The neat slant, the heavy ink. The first entry was dated decades before I was born. It talked about feeding the root to keep the rot from spreading. At first I thought it was some sort of gardening journal. But then the words started to turn. Wrong. He wrote about the thing under the foundation, as if it were alive. He described nights when it would shift in the soil, pressing against the walls of the cellar, making the beams groan. He wrote about leaving offerings, meat, sometimes blood, down in the dark to keep it still. I turned a page and a smear of something brown flaked off under my thumb. My stomach twisted when I realized it wasn't dirt. The entries got more frantic as the years went on. He said the root was hungry more often, and that the scratching was moving upward. There was one line underlined twice that made my skin crawl. If the feeding stops, the rot will take the house, and then the rest of us. The last pages were nearly illegible, ink running where water or tears had smeared the words. He mentioned the cellar door, the gouges in the wood, and something about passing it on to keep the family safe. I didn't want to read more, but my hands wouldn't let go. The journal felt heavier the longer I held it, as if it didn't want to leave my grip. Somewhere deep in the chimney, I thought I heard a faint scraping sound, like something shifting, waiting for me to finish reading. It wasn't still there last night. When I came into the kitchen that morning, the light was pale and cold, just barely spilling through the curtains. I was half asleep, rubbing my eyes, when I noticed something on the floor near the cellar door. Tiny dark spots. At first I thought it was spilled coffee or maybe mud tracked in from outside, but when I got closer, my stomach tightened. It was blood. It wasn't smeared like someone had stepped in it. These were neat little drops, spaced just far enough apart to look like something had been dripping as it moved, and they were fresh, bright, red. I looked toward the cellar door. The blood trail led straight to it, and then, down. My breath slowed, my ears filling with the rush of my own heartbeat. I stood there for a long time, staring, trying to think of any explanation that didn't make my skin crawl. There wasn't one. No one else had been in the house. I had locked every door, every window. I was sure of it. Still, my hand went to the latch. The hinges gave a low groan as the door swung open. A thin draft of cool, damp air slid up from below, carrying that heavy, earthy smell I'd learned to dread. The blood drops continued onto the top step, darker now in the shadow. My feet felt heavy, but I stepped down, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding the wall. The wood under me creaked, like it didn't want me there. At halfway down, the light from the kitchen faded. The steps in front of me were swallowed in darkness, but the blood kept going, each drop catching the faintest gleam from above. The smell down there was stronger, wetter. I listened. At first there was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint, uneven sound, not quite dripping, not quite scratching, something in between. The hair on my arms rose. My chest felt tight, like the air was getting harder to pull in. I couldn't make myself take another step. My body just froze. Every part of me screamed to turn around, and finally I listened. I backed up the stairs, keeping my eyes on the darkness until I was safely in the kitchen again. The cellar door clicked shut behind me. I stood there, hand still on the knob, heart pounding. When I finally looked down at my feet, there was a fresh drop of blood on the floor, and this time, it was right behind me. The walls smiled at me. I know how insane that sounds, but it's the truth. It started with a hairline crack in the far corner of the cellar. I noticed it one evening when I was down there trying to make sense of the blood trail from the day before. The air felt heavier than usual, damp in a way that made my clothes cling. My flashlight beam swept across the stone wall, and that's when I saw it, a jagged split running from the floor, almost halfway up the wall. Something about it drew me closer. The stones looked like they'd shifted just enough to make a thin opening, the edges chipped as if something had pushed from the other side. My light flickered when I leaned in. That's when I saw it. At first it was just shadow within shadow. Then it shifted, a face, so thin the skin clung like paper over bone, appeared in the crack. Hollow eyes stared back at me, too deep and too black to reflect the light. Its mouth twitched, then pulled upward into a grin so slow and deliberate, I felt my stomach twist. The crack seemed to widen as its lips stretched, the corners of its mouth splitting until they reached where ears should have been. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. Then it spoke. "Ills, we remember." The words weren't loud. They weren't even really sound. They slid into me low and steady, vibrating somewhere deep in my chest. My knees went weak. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam jerking wildly across the walls. When I aimed it at the crack again, the face was gone. But the fissure was bigger now, not by much, but enough for me to notice. The mortar around the stones was crumbling, small flakes littering the floor. My breathing was loud in my ears, fast and uneven, but the cellar was otherwise silent. I backed toward the stairs, never turning my back on the wall. Part of me expected the face to reappear, to grin again, to speak again. It didn't. By the time I reached the top of the steps, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. I slammed the door and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. And then from the other side of the wood, I heard it again. "We remember." This time it was smiling in my mind. This time it was smiling in my mind. The gaps weren't mistakes. They were sacrifices. I'd been staring at the family tree for hours, the candle burning low beside me. My eyes kept going back to the missing names, the strange spaces where whole generations seemed to skip. At first I thought it was poor record keeping, or maybe pages lost to time. But the cellar's whispers, they made me look differently. They made me see what my family had tried so hard to hide. I traced my finger down the parchment, over the neat ink of names I knew, then over the empty spaces between them. Every gap lined up with the years my family suddenly gained wealth, land, or power, and every one of those years matched the dates carved faintly into the cellar's foundation. I remembered the sound from below, like something shifting in the earth, and the faint smell of wet soil that clung to me every time I came back up the stairs. It wasn't just dirt down there. Something lived in it, something that had been fed. The old stories in our family said the house was built on good ground. I'd always thought that meant fertile soil. But the truth was darker. The ground was hungry, and my ancestors learned how to feed it. I could almost see it in my mind, a root system, thick and black, twisting deep beneath the house, pulsing with slow life. It didn't drink water, it drank people. Names were taken from the family, one by one, given to the thing below. Once it swallowed them, the roots erased them, like they had never been born. Not even their children remembered them. My stomach turned as I realized why I couldn't find records of my Uncle Thomas. Even though my mother swore he'd existed, he wasn't forgotten by accident. He'd been taken. The thought of those roots wrapping around someone's body, pulling them down into the soil, squeezing until they couldn't scream, it made my skin crawl. And yet, there was a strange, steady truth to it. This was the reason my family never starved, never went poor, never lost the house. I felt the floor beneath me, how warm it was in certain spots, almost like something breathing through the earth. My candle flickered, and for a moment I thought I heard a low groan, like the sound of a deep stomach waiting for its next meal. I pressed my hand to the wood, and something pressed back from below. The roots weren't just hungry, they were expecting me. The cellar door opened on its own. At first I thought the wind had caught it, or the storm outside was tearing at the house, rattling the windows so hard the glass shivered in its frame. But the air that rolled up from the dark wasn't the damp chill of a basement. It was colder, older. It carried the heavy stench of rot, like soil mixed with something long dead. Lightning flashed, white and violent, and for an instant I saw the steps leading down into blackness. My heart thudded when I caught movement, something shifting at the very bottom, too quick to make sense of. The thunder swallowed the sound of it, but I swore I heard a low scrape like nails dragging over stone. The wind howled through the open door, but it wasn't pushing its way inside. It felt like something was pulling, drawing the air down into the cellar instead. My candle went out, snuffed like a match in a storm, leaving me in the faint pulse of lightning through the windows. Another flash, and I saw them. Not shapes like shadows, but outlines of bodies, hunched and swaying, their skin a dull, wet grey. They weren't climbing the stairs. Not yet. They were waiting, watching. The storm outside grew worse, the house groaning against the wind, and the cellar seemed to breathe with it. Every rumble of thunder was answered by a faint, wet rustle below, like roots tearing through soil. I wanted to slam the door shut, but my legs wouldn't move. My hand gripped the frame, knuckles burning white, as a drop of water rolled down from the ceiling and landed on my wrist. Only it wasn't water. It was warm. Lightning ripped across the sky again, and this time the figures were closer. I saw hollow eyes fixed on me, mouths open just enough to show something moving inside, something that wasn't a tongue. The wind cut for a second, and in the silence between thunder I heard it. A voice. Soft, but carried on the air, curling up from the cellar like steam. My name. The storm roared back to life, shaking the floor under my feet. The cellar door creaked wider, as if the house itself was urging me toward it. The air was colder now, so cold my breath came out in clouds. The next lightning flash lit the stairs halfway up, and this time, they were climbing. Every step felt like walking into my own grave. The lantern in my hand swayed with my shaking, throwing thin slices of light down the narrow stairs. Each creak of the wood under my feet sounded too loud, swallowed up by the thick, suffocating air rising from below. The smell was worse now, not just rot, but something sweet underneath, like fruit left to liquefy in the sun. I kept my eyes fixed on the bottom, trying not to imagine what waited for me there. The walls closed in as I went lower, damp stone brushing my shoulders. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest with every breath. My heartbeat was loud enough to drown out the faint rustling somewhere ahead. When my foot touched the last step, the floor felt strange, softer than stone, but not quite dirt. My lantern's glow reached only a few feet before the dark swallowed it whole. That was when I saw it. The seal. It was set into the far wall, half buried in the earth, a round slab of stone covered in deep, uneven carvings. But it wasn't still. The surface bulged in slow, rhythmic pulses, like something inside was breathing. A fine line ran down its center, jagged and wet, and each time it moved, I heard a faint, sticky sound. My stomach twisted as I stepped closer. The smell was pouring from it, so thick I could taste it. My hand trembled as I lifted the lantern higher, and in the flicker of its light, I saw something shift just behind the crack. Something pale, something that twitched. I didn't mean to, but I leaned closer, my ear almost touching the stone. That's when I heard it. Not a voice exactly, but a rhythm. A slow, steady thump, like a heartbeat. The ground under my feet seemed to pulse with it. The seal's movements grew sharper, quicker, like whatever was behind it knew I was there. A drop of moisture slid down the crack and landed on my boot. It was warm. The lantern flickered, the flame dancing as a sudden draft curled around me from nowhere. The shadows on the wall stretched long and thin, reaching toward me. I staggered back, but the heartbeat sound grew louder, as if the seal was calling to me. And then, in the split second before my light steadied, I saw the crack widen, just enough for something inside to press against it. It pressed back. It didn't grow from the ground. It grew from the dead. The lantern's glow trembled across the cellar floor, and that's when I saw it clearly. What I thought had been some gnarled, petrified tree root was nothing like wood at all. It was a mass of blackened veins, thick and twisted, winding through the dirt like a nest of snakes. The veins pushed outward from a pile of skeletal remains, bursting through ribs and coiling around jawbones. The bones were old, some splintered, some crushed, and the black veins pulsed through them as if feeding. Each throb made the air shift, and a faint heat radiated from it, the same warmth I'd felt in the droplets on my boot. I wanted to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. I was staring at it the way you stare at a wound you know you shouldn't touch. My skin prickled as the pulse grew stronger. That's when the whispers began. They weren't coming from the air. They were in my head, soft at first, like a memory I couldn't place, then clearer, pleading, begging. Voices layered over each other, male and female, young and old, all tangled together like the veins themselves. Let us out. The words slid across my thoughts like cold water. My hand tightened on the lantern's handle until my knuckles ached. I could feel something pushing against me, not physically, but inside, like they were pressing their hands against the inside of my skull. The black veins shifted, curling higher, reaching toward me. They weren't roots. They were feeding tubes, pumping whatever this thing was into the bones and drawing something out in return. I could almost see it moving inside them, a thick, dark fluid swirling like oil. The pile of bones twitched. Not all at once, but here and there, a finger bone tapping, a jaw clenching, a rib shifting. The whispers grew frantic. Help us. It wasn't just one voice now. It was dozens, all pushing against me until I felt like my head would split. The smell of rot was thick enough to taste, and my stomach lurched. The largest vein quivered, and then something beneath the bones gave a sharp, wet crack. The pile sank slightly, as if whatever was under it had shifted. I could feel the pulse matching my heartbeat now, fast and unsteady. I stepped back, but the veins followed, sliding across the dirt toward me like they could smell my fear. The whispers stopped all at once, and in that sudden silence, the bones began to rise. They were waiting for me. At first I thought the cellar was empty again, that whatever had been here had slipped back into the walls, but then shapes began to move in the far corner where the lantern's light barely reached. Faces emerged from the shadows, pale, paper-thin skin stretched too tight, eyes clouded like frost over glass. I knew them, not from life, but from the old photograph I'd found in the attic. The missing ones, every gap in the family tree, my great-aunt who vanished on her wedding night, the uncle no one spoke of, cousins whose names were erased from records. They didn't speak, but their mouths were open. Wide, too wide. Silent screams that twisted their features into something not quite human. I couldn't hear them, but I could feel them in my bones. They stepped forward together, their bare feet silent on the dirt floor. My heart slammed against my ribs, and my legs wanted to run, but their eyes, God, their eyes locked me in place. One reached for me, a woman with hair that floated around her like she was underwater. Her fingers were cold before they even touched me. I flinched, but there was no malice in her face, only desperation. Then I felt it, a pull, not on my body, but on my life itself, tugging at something deep inside me. My vision blurred, the cellar fading at the edges. They didn't want to hurt me. They wanted me to join them. The truth hit me like ice in my veins. They weren't trapped here by choice. They were filling a space, holding something back. And if I stepped into that circle, one of them would go free and I would take their place. Their hands brushed my arms, my face, my hair. It was like standing in a cold wind made of grief. The woman's lips moved, forming a single word I couldn't hear but understood anyway. Please. I staggered back, but more of them emerged from the dark. Men, women, children. Dozens, their pale shapes filling every shadow until there was nowhere left to go. My back hit the wall, and their hands pressed harder. I could feel the cellar breathing now, a slow, deep inhale around us. The woman set's hand closed fully around mine. And for a split second, I saw myself standing among them. It will leave the rest if I give it one. The voice isn't loud, it isn't even in my ears, it blooms inside my skull like a thought I didn't have on my own. The root is still there in the cellar floor, thick and black, pulsing faintly as if it has a heart of its own. Its tendrils coil around my ankles, not pulling, just holding, waiting. I don't ask what it means. I already know. It wants someone of my blood. One life, given willingly, in exchange for the rest. The air feels thicker down here, heavy with damp soil and the smell of rot. My breath comes too fast, too shallow. My mind starts spinning through the names, the faces, people I know, people who wouldn't understand why I came for them. It doesn't say how, it doesn't have to. I picture it wrapping around someone's throat, pulling them under into the dark, their screams swallowed before anyone can hear. My stomach twists so hard I think I might be sick. I could end this now. The gaps in the family tree would stop growing. No one else would vanish, but it wouldn't be gone. It would just be sleeping, waiting for the next weak link to give in. I hear movement above me, footsteps on the floorboards, light, careful. Someone's come looking. My pulse jumps. If they come down here, the choice will be made for me. The root tightens slightly, just enough to remind me I'm not in control. That voice comes again, smooth and patient. One for all, one for all. I think of my mother's face, the way her hands tremble when she's worried. I think of my cousin, who never stopped asking why our family won't talk about the past. I think of the children, nieces, nephews, faces unmarked yet by fear. My throat is dry as dust. The steps above pause, whoever it is, they're standing at the top of the cellar stairs now. I realize my hands are shaking. Not from fear, but from something colder, something close to surrender, because part of me wants to call them down. The voice leans into my thoughts, coaxing, promising. One for all. The stairs creak. A shadow moves against the dim light above, and my lips part before I can stop them. The stone cracked and the house breathed. It was a long, shuddering exhale, like something that had been holding its breath for years was finally letting go. Dust fell from the ceiling. The air shifted, warmer now, wetter. I didn't have time to think about what I'd just done. The seal lay in pieces at my feet, pale shards scattered across the dirt floor. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then the ground trembled. A deep vibration rose through my shoes, up my legs, settling in my bones. From the gap where the seal had been, something began to move. At first it was just a ripple in the soil. Then the earth split, and the root burst upward like it had been waiting for this exact second. It wasn't smooth or clean. It was jagged, twisted, glistening as though it was wet with sap or blood. It shot up and coiled around my legs before I could step back. Its grip was cold. Not the cold of stone, but the cold of something alive that doesn't know warmth. I tried to pull free, but each movement only made it tighten. That's when I heard them. The figures in the shadows, those I had thought were trapped souls, leaned forward. Their mouths opened, and they screamed. But it wasn't pain. It wasn't pain. It wasn't relief. It was hunger, a sound so raw it scraped at my mind. Their faces stretched unnaturally wide, their eyes locked on me. Some stumbled toward me, their bodies jerking like marionettes with tangled strings. I thought freeing them would save them, but they weren't prisoners. They were starving animals, and I had just cut the chain. The root pulsed against my skin, and every throb felt like it was drawing something out of me. My breath hitched, my chest felt tight. The screaming grew louder, closer, almost gleeful. I could feel my strength bleeding away, like water draining from a cracked glass. My knees buckled. My vision blurred at the edges, but through it I saw their hands, long, sharp, shaking, not reaching for the root, but for me. I opened my mouth to beg, to apologize, to say something, but the house shuddered again, a sound like a low, satisfied sigh. The root pulled harder. My feet slid across the dirt toward the gap, and as the figures reached me, their shadows swallowed the last of the light. There was only one gap left to fill. I could feel it before I even understood it. A sharp tug in my chest, like a thread being pulled from somewhere far away. My legs were still tangled in the root's grip, its cold touch seeping deeper into me, but my mind was suddenly upstairs, in the study, where the family tree hung on the wall. I saw it as clearly as if I were standing in front of it. The long yellowed parchment, the careful black ink, and then movement. The root's pull was in my veins now, and on the paper, my name shimmered like it was sweating under heat. Then it began to fade. It didn't vanish all at once. The edges of each letter curled and blackened, turning to ash before peeling away. I wanted to scream, to run up there and press my hand over it, to hold it in place somehow, but the part of me that could fight was slipping. The screaming figures were closer now, circling, their eyes bright with a kind of feverish recognition. They knew what was happening. I was becoming the final missing name, the one that would make the tree whole. The air grew heavier, thicker, pressing against my skin like water. Every breath was work. I thought of the gaps in the tree, how I used to stare at them and wonder what tragedies they hid. I never thought I'd end up being one of them. Upstairs, the last curve of my name flaked away, and the space where it had been glowed faintly. Not empty anymore. Filled. The parchment almost seemed to sigh in relief. The root tightened its hold, pulling me down toward the jagged opening it had come from. My heels dug into the dirt, but it was no use. Every tug sank me deeper into that cold grip. The screaming around me wasn't just hunger now. It was celebration. I realized the cellar, the seal, the gaps, they were never about keeping something in. They were about keeping the family tree alive, feeding it, filling it, and now my place was set. The last thing I saw before the dirt rose around my ankles was the flicker of movement upstairs, the family tree shifting, the ink twisting as if making room for something new. Not my name anymore. Something older, something that had been waiting. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't being erased. I was being claimed. When the paper was blank, the cellar went silent. That's how I found it, years later, tucked in a dusty frame at the back of an antique shop. At first, I thought it was just a piece of aged parchment, maybe water-damaged, maybe ruined by time. But when I leaned closer, I saw the faint outlines of names. No, not names. Shadows of names. As if they had once been there, pressed deep into the fibers, then pulled out completely. Every inch of the tree was empty. The branches were still drawn, curling and splitting into delicate lines, but they held nothing. No dates, no handwriting, just space. I asked the shopkeeper where it had come from. She only shrugged, said a man had dropped it off along with a box of other things, claiming it belonged to his grandmother. I could tell she didn't want to talk about it. Her eyes darted to the frame, then away again, like looking at it too long made her uncomfortable. The moment I touched the glass, a faint vibration hummed against my fingertips, not loud, not sharp, just present, a low reminder that whatever had been here wasn't gone. I bought it. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the way it seemed to want to be taken. I carried it home, and for days I couldn't stop staring at it. It felt like it was waiting for something. Then, a week later, I heard about the cellar, a rumor from a neighbor who said there was an old property at the edge of town that had been locked for decades. No one had ever gone inside. I almost didn't go, but the tree, empty as it was, made me feel like I had to. When I got there, the house was barely standing. The cellar doors were chained, but the earth beneath them was different, loose, freshly turned, like someone had dug there recently and covered it back up. The air around it was cold, even in the afternoon sun, and I swear I heard something move under the dirt, a faint shift, like roots pushing through soil. I left without opening it. But when I came home, the tree in the frame was different. There was a single mark now, not a name, just the faint outline of a branch, and at its end one empty space, waiting.